a few more moments to join us. I hope you will.
And we will do the same, Rabbi. I'll talk till like, what is it, my time here? 8:35, 8:40, and then I'll open it up for Q&A for about 5 minutes.
That's fine. So we'll see, give people a few more moments to get on.
I'm actually surprised that people aren't here punctually. I mean, given this is Vienna, I would think that if it's Vienna, everyone knows you've got to be on time. I mean, Poland, I get, Russia, I get, you can be half an hour late and it's Jewish time. You weren't serious. You really meant, what time is it there? 1:30? What time is it by you guys?
Oh, it's 9:30.
9:30.
Greetings from Florida. Hello.
This is
Hi,
Eric. Eric is a member of Central Synagogue and traveled with Central Synagogue to Israel in August of 2019 and was on my bus. And a fan and a friend. So shalom, Eric.
Very nice. Just wait another minute or two. By the way, everyone, Mike and I are meeting next week with some other people to plan a European Jewish journey for Wilshire Boulevard Temple. So good morning, Donna. Good morning, Merle. Nice to have you. I know it's 10:30 in Arizona, she said. Yeah.
Somewhere it's 5:30, which means if you want to have a cocktail, you can. But
right. Well, I never have a cocktail, so yeah, we'll wait till 9:35 because I see more people are slowly trickling in. So here it's 78 degrees in Los Angeles. It's going to be today. Beautiful. So we're happy because we've had some cold. This week it's going to be up to 80, where it's freezing all over, at least half the country. So
we were up at we were 70 today, but it's going to start raining again tomorrow and tomorrow up until Saturday. So.
Oh, nice seeing you, Mike. Live long and prosper. That's the Star Wars greeting.
No, Star Trek, I think.
I meant Star Trek, yeah.
I as bizarre as this might sound, in high school I was more into Jewish education than sci-fi TV and movies. Crazy as that sounds.
I was never into sci-fi. I'm into detective novels. Oh, thank you. We had a Carole King Shabbat last Friday night, and we had sang her songs, and she turned 80. She turned 80, so we sort of celebrated Jewish music.
The second to last show I saw on Broadway, it must be 3 years ago now, was her. What was it called?
Beautiful.
Oh my gosh, that was such an amazing show. And years ago, my wife and I were lucky in New York that we saw, what was it called? Two Brothers, maybe? And she was the main. I didn't realize this. We went to see a Broadway show, and it was Carole King who was like in the starring show. Like, whoa, we're seeing Carole King concert and an amazing Broadway show. So.
All right, well, we're going to begin. So welcome, Mike, to our second in a series of 5 of European Jewish journeys. This week it's Vienna. Next week is it Prague?
Prague, I don't remember. Yeah, it could be. We should check the calendar because I got to make
Prague, sure. And we have
Amsterdam.
I think Amsterdam's the last one.
And maybe
Lithuania, Vilna. Yeah. So. All right, so I'm going to turn off my camera and my mute, and we'll listen. And then at the end, we'll have some questions. And so if you have questions, save them or put them in the chat, and we'll answer them at the end. So enjoy, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi. Shalom. Good morning to you. Good evening to me. I come back, actually, maybe I've got a little bit of perk to my step or my voice, a little bit of sunshine. I was up for 2 days up on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, thankfully, with a group of colleagues who are doing a seminar for an educational company that brings kind of university, second degree, professional degree students to Israel. There's a lot of excitement and a lot of, and since I last spoke to you a week ago, actually, there's lots of emails of people coming to Israel, and very, very optimistic that travel is going to be reignited, and we're going to have more people here, and hopefully in Europe too. We are continuing the saga of Theodor Herzl, which last week took us to his birthplace in Budapest. Today is taking us to Vienna. There you can see again the Belvedere. We'll see some of the art from the Belvedere. And as I mentioned last week, my guess is more of you have been to Vienna than Budapest, probably. There's Budapest on the left. I switched the order from last week because we were in Budapest last week. We talked about the complex story of the Jewish story in Budapest. We're going to talk about the complex story in Vienna. Very close similarities, but also many dissimilarities. But again, that kind of roller coaster journey of up to 1,000 years of Jewish life in Europe, good times, bad times, expulsions, persecutions, mass murders, etc. And then here, even more, I think, than what I talked about last week in Budapest, was really seeing the amazing Jewish contribution to the flowering and the blossoming and the creativity of the fin de siècle, as they say in French, the end of the century life in Vienna, and the Jewish contribution to that. So first, as always, we're going to start with a little history. And what I like about this two-part series, Vienna and Budapest, is that a lot of it focuses through the prism of Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism. I mentioned before, he was born right where that Doheny, the beautiful Doheny synagogue, which I showed you a number of pictures last week, in 1860. And he recalls when he already has written his first book, The Jewish State, and a year after the First Zionist Congress, and he writes in an article, "I was born in Budapest, close to the synagogue in which the rabbi recently, right, since he came up with political Zionism, criticized me with the utmost severity because I'm trying to obtain more honor and freedom for Jews than they currently enjoy. My earliest memory of the school were the caning I received for not remembering the details of the exodus of the Jews from Egypt. Nowadays, many a schoolmaster would like to cane me for remembering the exodus rather too well. Typical, quite wealthy, actually, Jewish family, Orthodox grandfather, they moved from the rural area into the city, and as they integrated, I don't want to necessarily use the word assimilated, but as they integrated and acculturated into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they moved further and further away from Judaism, really for the first time, being allowed to be equal citizens of the realm. And Herzl's family was part of this kind of early to mid 19th century process. As a 19-year-old, he moves to Vienna, studies law in Vienna, but yet as a Jew, although accepted at the university, he was excluded from Jewish fraternities. Very anti-Semitic feeling in Vienna at the time, particularly under Karl Lueger, very prominent anti-Semitic mayor who served for, I want to say, 12 or more years. And in this period, it was Herzl who saw the collapse of what was a dream, this kind of liberal dream that Jews could integrate into the rest of Europe. On the one hand, meeting this group of what the Israeli political scientist Shlomo Avineri refers to as populist rabble-rousers, many of whom voted for Karl Lueger, using the vote and the political system to transfer power from the liberal to conservative politicians. So Jews were once again stuck in between the tensions that existed in Europe at the time. And as I say, although Herzl successfully integrated into Vienna amongst comfortable Jewish liberal intellectuals, he soon began to realize that as the empire in which he lived began to unravel, the Jewish tragedy was moving from Eastern to Central Europe. And he saw anti-Semitism, as you'll see in the next slide, as part of the malaise of European politics. Keep in mind the context of Europe. 100 years before was the French Revolution, a time in which the entire, this massive watershed event happens where the people are sovereign. America, I talked about last week as well, being born in 1776, we the people. The world is being, Western civilization, quote unquote, is being organized in a very, very different manner. Where do the Jews fit into this? And again, in the nation state model of Europe, different than America, Jews had a bit of a challenge. So here is Herzl, who writes as a correspondent of the Viennese New Free Press, goes to the trial of Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jew in the French army, and he's totally broken by the cries of death to the Jews in the street. Here is the city that 100 years before had the revolution of liberty, equality, fraternity. Here was the place in which the rights of man was written. And he writes, quote, Herzl, that there was this unholy alliance between politicians, churchmen, and generals. So he wasn't just talking about Zionism, and here's a copy a picture, I should say, from somebody I know and I've guided and I've befriended, who lives in Toronto, David Matlow, who's the world's biggest collector of Herzl paraphernalia. I might have mentioned his name last week. There is the first print, or one of the first print of the Jewish state, and there is Dr. Theodor Herzl, his calling card when he lived in Paris, his business card when he lived in Paris. And as I said, Zionism for Herzl wasn't just a response to the masses of oppressed Jews in the Pale of Settlement suffering from anti-Semitism, but also was a response to this unholy alliance in emancipated, enlightened Central Europe, in which he had thought, and many others had thought, that the Jews were finally able to be just like everybody else. In 1895, before he writes the book, after the Dreyfus trial, before he writes the book, he writes in his diary, in Paris he went to a synagogue, and he found the services reminded him of his youth in that synagogue that we saw last week in Pest, on the eastern side of Budapest. I looked around me at the Paris Jews and saw a familiar likeness to the features. Was it then or earlier that I conceived of writing about the situation of the Jews? So he remembers Judaism, but it wasn't really engaged in Judaism in Budapest and then in Vienna. Later on, he writes, that summer, a month later, we must become people of inventors, warriors, artists, etc. Now we are free. Now any Jew can rise to any rank within the state. In other words, we have to have our own state so we can do everything. We've honestly tried, he writes in The Jewish State in 1896, we've honestly tried everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities and to preserve the faith of our fathers. We are not permitted to do so. We have lived for centuries and we are still cried down as strangers. The distinctive nationality of Jews neither can nor will nor must be destroyed. This has been demonstrated during 2,000 years of appalling suffering. And here is Herzl writing essentially saying, listen, we've tried. We were emancipated, we participated in the Enlightenment, and we thought we could be a part of and be equal to the rest of Europe, but we cannot. And therefore we need our own state. And part of my friend David's collection is this incredible series of correspondence. Here you can see Theodor Herzl in Vienna. There he is, Dr. Theodor Herzl. There's a letter, I think, up over here that he writes. There it is, from the New Free Press, from the desk of somebody else writes it to Theodor Herzl. And it's amazing because, as I mentioned, I think in one of my series last year, for some of you who were there, it's not really Jewish history, it's Jewish memory. And up until the modern era, there was no sense of Jewish history. There was the sense that what happens to us as a people is a function of our behavior and whether God rewards or punishes us. And Herzl is born into a world in which the notion of Jewish history and our interaction with the larger society has importance, as well as the theological aspect of the relationship between the Jewish people and God. And I just love this because we actually get to see the handwriting of and the future recipient of Theodor Herzl, a real person who lived actually not that long ago in Vienna. 1897, he decides to organize the first Zionist Congress. After he writes the booklet, The Jewish State, a year later, he wants to have it in Munich, but the rabbis in Munich say, thank you, but no thank you, not in my backyard. Why would the leading intellectuals and the rabbis, the leaders of the Jewish community, want to have a conference in their city or in their country that would suggest that maybe the Jewish people, in the context of what he saw in 1894 in Paris, in which the Jewish people could promote this idea that the Jews deserve the state like everybody else? No thank you. So it goes to Zurich. They say no thank you as well. And then he goes to the relatively quiet city of Basel, where there is a Jewish community, a kosher restaurant, and there in the Casino Hotel, he has a congress. 200 people come from 24 countries across Europe, including America, by the way. By the second Congress, 2 years later, women are given the right to vote. And I say that because that's a full 20 years before they're given the right to vote in America and most of the Western countries. At the end of this first conference, Herzl writes in his diary, quietly, subtly, I should say, in Basel, I founded the Jewish state. Were I to say this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. Perhaps within 5, certainly 50 years, everyone will perceive it. And truth be told, he was quite prophetic, because 50 years after 1897's first Zionist Congress in Basel, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine and create a state for the Jewish people. Those of you who remember in the fall, my series of 6 presentations with the Declaration of Independence. So a prophet before his time. Herzl lives only 7 years after the first Zionist Congress. His second book is published in 1902 called the AltNoiland, written in German. And here I've chosen a few images, including the one in the middle, which came out by a youth movement in Israel a number of years ago, maybe in the centennial of the writing of the book. There is an image by Kadishman, the Israeli artist, and you can see written in Amharic for the Ethiopian Israelis, English and French and Hebrew and Arabic and Russian as well. Here is a modern Hebrew version of it with a picture of Herzl on the boat, and there is a copy, cover of the original book written in 1902. And in this quasi-utopian book, Herzl writes what he thought he would see, and based on his visit to Palestine, what this new future state would look like. It's translated into Hebrew as the AltNoiland, you can see it here, or as AltNoiland, the original text in German, but when in 1902 or 3 it's translated into Hebrew, it's translated as Tel Aviv. Now, why Tel Aviv? There was no city Tel Aviv until 1906, the idea, in 1909, the building, and it officially only was named Tel Aviv in like 1910 or 1912. But Tel Aviv is actually a place named in the Bible where we lived in exile in Babylon 2,500 years ago. But Tel Aviv is actually this beautiful word in Hebrew that describes something old. A tel is in Hebrew, a series of layers of civilization. Think James Michener's The Source, one on top of the other. And Aviv is spring, as in the season. So the connotation of, in order to look forward and to be reborn as in springtime, we need to be rooted in something that is old and ancient and multi-layered, and that is the name of Tel Aviv, chosen as a city after the name Tel Aviv that the Hebrew translator gave to Herzl's book in 1902. But I digress, but it's a good story, I think. Anyway, he writes this book, and in this book, he has this conversation between elites in Vienna and a rabbi who is describing anti-Semitism in part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Moravia. Rabbi Weiss describes the conversation at this dinner party with these affluent Viennese Jews, and he says, "I feel it coming. We'll all have to wear the yellow badges or emigrate," said the rabbi. Now, this is 1902. There is no yellow badge in Germany yet. Hitler is in power, but it's a yellow badge based on that 13th century Fourth Lateran Council of the Vatican that said that Jews had to wear distinguishing markings on their clothing, right? So they're all talking and schmoozing. Don't read all the text here about what's going to happen. Even in France, the anti-Semites, and this is all Herzl's voice coming in, right? Even in France, the anti-Semites have the upper hand. And Herzl is living in Vienna. Karl Luger is a very openly anti-Semitic mayor in Vienna at the time. And then the rabbi, this simple rabbi from a provincial town, says, a new movement has arisen. He's speaking, of course, of Zionism. Its aim is to solve a Jewish problem through colonization on a large scale. All who can bear their present lot will return to our old home, to Palestine. He spoke very quietly, unaware that people about him were getting ready to laugh. He was therefore dumbfounded at the effect of the word Palestine. The laughter ran the whole gamut. The rabbi, deeply embarrassed, did not again raise his eyes from his plate, while the humorist zealously dissected the new idea. Here's Herzl, through this fictional story, telling us the negative response of the Jews in Vienna to the rise of Zionism. So we saw last week Herzl's birth in Budapest. We saw just now how he moves as a young adult with his family and studies law from Budapest to Vienna. He then goes 1894 to Paris, writes the book, has the first Zionist Congress, writes the second book. I'm going to go back a bit now and look at Jewish history as it develops in Vienna. Like we've seen in many places together, ups and downs in the cycle of what I call prosperity to persecution to prosperity over centuries. Jews first came to Vienna about 800 years ago. And there, like we've seen in many places, there were servants of the royal chamber under Leopold V. However, shortly after their arrival, 16 Jews were killed, sanctioned by the Pope. Later on, the Black Plague, the following century, comes along. Vienna was one of the few cities where Jews were not blamed, by the way, across Europe, and other Jews therefore came from far and wide and settled there. However, in the next century, the Jews lost everything in a major act of violence and fire and destruction in 1420-21, when the Jews were no longer useful, as I mentioned, I think in a previous session last year, were no longer useful to the imperial household. The Duke expelled us, imprisoned those of means, and those who didn't leave were then burnt. The synagogue was destroyed, and the foundation of that synagogue today is part of the Jewish Museum in Vienna, and it's multiple stories underground in the Judenplatz, which we'll see a little bit later. It takes centuries until the Jews return, small group of 10 privileged families in the year 1700. More come 1782 at the Austro-Hungarian Edict of Toleration, abolishing, but again, as I said last week, not out of love and not full citizenship, abolishing many discriminatory regulations, but limiting residence only to those of means, and the city continues to grow in the 19th century. And so we've got French Revolution, a little bit later, this active tolerance in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then what happens? 1848, we saw last week in Budapest, Jews, were, Magyarians, Magyar-speaking Hungarians of the Mosaic tradition, similar in Vienna. A community is officially established mid-19th century, and look at the numbers. 1867 gives us citizenship. The numbers grow from 6,200 in 1860 to 100, almost, and 50,000 by 1900. That is huge. In 40 years' time for the population to grow that much. Again, as I showed you a bit earlier, many coming from rural areas and coming and settling in the big cities. And what did Jews do? They pretty much did everything, predominant in all spheres of life. And look at the areas that I've chosen to highlight. Some of the famous figures we'll meet a little bit later, the salons, but the areas of medicine, the area of politics, the area of philosophy, Martin Guger, the arts, Mahler, Schoenberg before he converted, Schoenberg, Strauss, Kalman, Max Reinhardt, scientists, Kafka, Stefan Zweig. I mean, you name the fields, and we'll meet some of these people a little bit later, world-renowned figures for much of their creativity. 3 out of 4 Austrian Nobel Prize winners in medicine were Jews. More than half of the physicians and dentists were Jews. 60% of lawyers, university professors, many Jews were leaders in one particular party, the Social Democrats. Phenomenal, rapid growth in a very, very, very short period of time. Some would even say meteoric growth in a series of decades, right? 6,000 in 1860, almost 150,000 by 1900. Phenomenal. And as I read last week from Katie Martin's book about the Jews who managed to escape Hitler and settled in America and were responsible for so many, and were involved in so many fields of expertise, it's this incredible Budapest, and even more so Vienna, became these incredible centers of creativity, like other places in the world then, Berlin and New York, obviously today, and Los Angeles, obviously today, definitely those affiliated with Wilshire Boulevard Temple. Sorry, I digress once again, but an amazing, amazing city. And much of the center was focused in this area called the Ringstrasse, this boulevard that was constructed 1857 by the emperor, who wanted to build a grand boulevard on the former city fortifications to showcase the importance of the Habsburg dynasty. If you go to Vienna today, A, it's part of the UNESCO World Heritage listing, but B, once the walls were dismantled in Vienna, these massive buildings, private residences, multi-story private residences were built around the city. They became these incredible status symbols for nobility. Many Jewish industrialists and bankers who were very much a part of contributing to this period of growth were also active patrons and supporters of the arts, built magnificent palatial homes along the Ringstrasse. Almost half of the properties were Jewish. This is taken from an exhibit of the Ringstrasse I visited a few years ago in Vienna. And today, when you visit, many of the cultural icons in the city are either on the Ringstrasse or just outside of the Ringstrasse. This was the city before the fortifications, and essentially this massive ring road. And in fact, I found a while ago, a short little video on, is it opening up? Please open big. Full screen unavailable. Don't do that to me. Oh well. Is it unavailable? Oh well. It's not that exciting. A short little video. Try to do it this way. Hold it. Incredible imperial architecture. We can say a lot over here. We can say a lot about imperialism, good, bad, and ugly, but there's no question that the Ringstrasse is still, I think, the defining element of the city to this very day. And when one goes to Vienna and you visit all the museums and the palaces and whatever, it's all pretty much proximate to this incredible Ringstrasse. And remember, it only was built in the mid-19th century, and the Jews were very much a part. And to have a city change after centuries, such a transformative change, and at the exact same time that this massive influx of Jewish population, 6,000 to 147,000 in 40 years, gives you a sense of how involved the Jews were in that process. The great Czech writer Kundera describes in an essay I didn't write it, he wrote it many months ago, that the Jews were the intellectual cement of Middle Europe. Of course, they were not sculptors, but here is a sculpture by the great Rodin of Gustav Mahler, perhaps one of the greatest Jewish till he converted to Catholicism, we'll see in 2 minutes' time, but one of the greatest Jewish contributors to art in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Of course, Gustav Klimt was not Jewish. Many of his patrons, many of the subjects that he painted, as you see, two of the paintings from the one of the museums that I took when I was last there in probably 3 years ago now. Very important patrons of the art. In the Art History Museum over here, you can see a number of Rembrandts. And again, nothing Jewish. I'm just giving you a sense of when one goes to Vienna, you go to these great palaces of culture, whether it's opera, whether it's the visual arts. And the Jews in that period were very, very involved in promoting, sponsoring, and of course, ensuring its continuity. Van Gogh wasn't Jewish, but you will see in a couple weeks' time when we visit Amsterdam together, how ultimately it was Jewish patrons of the art who also were the ones who really made Van Gogh into what we see him today, really in the earlier parts of the 20th century. Gustav Mahler, there's a picture, there he is. Gustav Mahler, born in Bohemia, we would call it probably the Czech Republic today, studied in Vienna. He had to convert to Catholicism in order to become the director of the Vienna Court Opera in 1897. Years later, however, and there's a picture of the opera, where is it? Years later, in late 19th, early 20th century, again, one of the iconic images of Vienna. Years later, the Nazis kind of ban all compositions by Gustav Mahler. Here it says, here's where he lived from 1898 until 1909. And what's incredible about this is that in the late 19th century, Jews believed that they could be like everybody else. There were certain glass ceilings. In order to get around them, you had to convert. University, right? Herzl was accepted.
Mike, I want to interrupt. Could everybody please stop putting comments in the chat until the end? It's very distracting, the comments. Please do not put your personal thoughts in the chat right now. There's time after. It's just distracting.
Thank you. I'm too focused on my slides. But now I look, there are a lot of text. So I echo the rabbi sentiment. And Mahler converts to Catholicism. It wouldn't have mattered, by the way, in the 1930s. In 1938, after the Anschluss, when Germany takes over, marches in the spring of 48 and takes over Austria, because anybody who was a Jewish parent or a Jewish grandparent would ultimately have been murdered. And so when you go to Vienna, as I say, you visit these amazing palaces of culture, and you say to yourself, wow, the architecture is amazing, what's in them, the performances, the art, absolutely amazing. But then if you kind of peel back a little bit of the veneer and you look at the complexity, and it's a very complex story, Jewishly, that, as I said, things were good, things were bad, things were good, things were bad. But what happened in the modern era, you'll see, is very, very, I think, challenging and perhaps even disturbing. So there were two great figures of the opera, Gustav Mahler, of course, and Richard Wagner. And Wagner, when I was there last time, I'm walking, there's the opera at night. When I was walking around, I see the sign, which put up in 1933, you can see over here. And it says that this was in this house where he lived from 1875 until whatever. I don't speak German, but you're very proud of Wagner. And of course, we know that under Nazi Germany, Wagner was venerated, and Mahler was the exact opposite. I can't even figure the correct word for that. And so back then, turn of the 19th, 20th century, Jews very much a part of the art and cultural scene, and within 3 decades, persona non grata. How does perhaps one of the most significant epicenters of Western culture, Vienna, late 19th, early 20th century, how does it get from there to where we're going to get to in a few minutes is a question I don't have an answer to, not a straightforward answer to, but it's one of the lessons of Jewish life in Europe. 2 books that I use a lot when I put this together, when I guide in Vienna. One, you've seen the movie, read the book, it's even better, The Story of Lady in Gold, how the Klimt masterpiece was finally reclaimed by one of your landsmen from Los Angeles, thankfully, the niece, if I'm not mistaken, I could get it wrong, of Adele Bloch, and the Los Angeles-based lawyer who helps her get the piece of art back. Today it's in the Neue Gallery in the Upper East Side in Manhattan, if I'm not mistaken. And a book that my friend and colleague in Vienna suggested I read, because everybody's seen Lady in Gold, a story of a young man who grows up in Melbourne or in Sydney, sorry. His name is Tim Bonyadi, and he grows up in a non-Jewish home. He does not know that his mother and aunt were survivors who fled in 1938 from Vienna, converted later on converted out of Judaism, I should say, in Australia, and he never found out until much later, many years later, the secret of his family. And it's a book story of his life, his mother and his aunt's life there. And I read a few quotes from his book. Amazing. Good Living Street. I recommend it. An extraordinary transformation in 50 years. From a city almost without Jews to the most Jewish city in Western Europe. As I mentioned, massive population change. Stefan Zweig, I should say, who we're not going to really meet here, born in Austria, lives in Vienna, and then he, after the Anschluss in 38, flees, goes to England, I think, and then America, and then goes to South America. 1943, writes his memoir called Yesterday and Today, The World of Yesterday, and then he and his wife take their life. He was the best-selling writer in German language before the spring of 1933 in Europe. To put in context, Jew, Stefan Zweig. And this is quoting from the Israeli author Amos Elon, who describes life in Germany, Jewish life in Germany. Almost all the Viennese art and culture, recognized and admired by the world, was promoted, nourished, or created by the Jews. That's a very powerful testimony, I should say, to the involvement of Jews in the world of arts and culture. And I might suggest, you Los Angelinos, just as Jews are serious patrons of the arts in the 2 great artistic centers in America, LA, that's right, LA and New York, even more so in Vienna in this very, very short period. And just think of the journey that it took Jews coming to the West Coast, in particular in California, to get to the point where Metro Goldwyn Mayer can actually keep their names and wouldn't have to change their names, as happened maybe a generation before them. Similar story in Vienna. And Zweig, he was an amazing writer, describes it, and he says, there was hardly a city in Europe where the drive toward cultural ideals was as passionate as in Vienna. The city had grown beautiful illusion, whatever the word is, simile maybe. A city had grown like a tree that adds ring upon ring, and instead of the old fortification walls, the Ringstrasse encircled the treasured core with its splendid houses. Phenomenal. But yet, the city continues to elect for 13 years Karl Lueger, populist mayor, very, 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 very anti-Semitic. Paris and Vienna at the time, probably the most anti-Semitic places in Europe. By the time Austria, after the First World War, right, it's no longer Austro-Hungarian Empire, is founded, 90% of the Jews in Austria lived in Vienna, with over 200,000 Jews. Now, that's 20% of the population, similar numbers to what we saw in Budapest last week. And as Tim Boiardi describes in his book, typical of Jews who came from the provinces of the empire, Herzl's family, good example, enriched Vienna at least as much as it enriched them until the late 1930s. And that's a beautiful line. That's why I chose this quote, because there's this kind of symbiosis between the Jews and the non-Jews in creativity in this short 50-year period. And then with extraordinary speed, he continues, were all gone from the city that expected would always be their home. And I did a session earlier this week, and I think I did it with you guys a year ago on Spain. And that whole question of, what makes a golden age, what creates it? It's not just absence of persecution, it's some sort of fertile creativity, and that was abundant in Vienna. How does it end? Literally in a blitzkrieg fashion, borrowing from the German term, in Vienna. Freud pens his interpretation of dreams. Klimt was going on his own journey over there. All of this happening and all of this supported by Jews. At the same time, there was this rise of anti-Semitism. And one last quote over here from an article, literally just found this 2-3 months ago, 2015. Fin de siècle, Vienna was the source of fascination for cultural historians for the past 40 years. Why? Right? The Jews were very involved, but listen to this. Jews were at the center of both the explosion of creativity and the rise of anti-Semitism. Many of the great creative figures of the turn of the century were Jewish, and thousands of Vienna's Jews were killed by the Nazis or driven in exile, many to enrich post-war culture in every field in Britain and America. Similar to what we saw last week in Budapest, right? Jews, but it's a very powerful line. Jews were at the center of the explosion of creativity and the rise of anti-Semitism. Similar story, by the way, in Berlin, if I were going to add another community. The most famous art movement at the time in Vienna, late 19th century, Klimt was obviously at the forefront of this, was this notion of the sacred spring of the secessionist movement. There was a small little museum. Every time I go, it seems to be under renovation. They might have been creative in their art, but not good in terms of their, sealing things and whatever else. But just across the street, literally a block away from the Ringstrasse, there is the museum of the secessionist movement, and again, some of the more famous Klimt paintings. Now, what's going on Jewishly? Well, in Vienna, complicated story in the 20s and 30s. There is a fascist dictator, Dollfuss, who becomes chancellor barely by democratic vote, similar to Hitler's rise in Germany, by the way. He is a fascist government, but softer than neighboring Germany. He prevents parliament from sitting. Basically, he doesn't use anti-Semitism as a tool, but in fact, he cracks down on the Nazi Party, which ultimately leads to him being assassinated by the Nazis, and they try a push. There is a plebiscite in Austrian independence, and eventually Hitler and the Germans march, the 12th of March, 1938, into Austria, greeted warmly by tens of thousands of cheering Austrians with flowers. Jewish businesses and apartments were looted that same night. So, witness for 5 years and 2 months what's happening in Germany since January 33. Germany takes over Austria. They officially annex it. In the spring, as I say, the Nuremberg laws, which were passed a couple years earlier in Germany, are then passed over to Austria as well. And look at the numbers here. 50,000 Austrian Jews, 25% of the population, flees between March and November. Why? Because they, unlike the Jews in Germany, saw what happened under Hitler's regime from January 1930 until March of 1933, until 38. And so they fled. By the time Kristallnacht comes along, right, 24 Viennese Jews are killed, thousands of shops and apartments are destroyed and taken over. Over 100,000 Jews had left. And in fact, by the spring of 39, 140,000 Jews have left, and there are about 70,000 Jews left. And huge numbers fled, but of those 65,000 left, the majority ultimately were murdered in the Holocaust. What survived Kristallnacht? Only one synagogue. This amazing synagogue built in the early 19th century, the Stadt Temple, one of almost 100 that survived. Why? Its entrance was hidden. And when you visit Vienna today, here's the inside of it. And these are both pictures from my phone. When I was last there with a group meeting with one of the rabbis in the synagogue, Orthodox, I should say, there's a sign in Hebrew, but there's also lots of cameras around. And in order to get into the synagogues, you have to submit a list of your group beforehand with their passports and write a letter. And we're a Jewish, synagogue coming from Los Angeles. We want to come visit. Not so easy. Very, very intense security there, I will add. There are probably 6,000 to 8,000 Jews who live in Vienna today, but very secluded, and that's why the synagogue survived. Because you go through here, and this isn't actually the entrance. It is the entrance to the complex, but it's protected by other buildings all around it, and that is the theory as to why this one of 93 synagogues survived. There's not a lot of feeling of Jewish life in Vienna. And as I say, you need to look upwards to see the signs. So there's a sign that says, these were the stairs that are near the area where Herzl lived when he was in Vienna in these years. And here is a horrible sign on the backside. Here's the facade again of the synagogue. On the back of the synagogue, it's a sign that says here in German and in Hebrew, here Nirtzachu Yidei Mechablim, here killed by Palestinian terrorists in 1981, I think it was, where people were coming for simcha, I think it was a bar mitzvah, at the Viennese synagogue. So there is Jewish presence, but it's hidden and actually protected, unfortunately. A footnote, read Daniel Silva's books with Gabriel alone, the protagonist, and one of them begins, I think it's called Murder in Vienna, based pretty much on the story of the terror incident that happened outside of the synagogue. Perhaps the most famous Jew to come out of this period in Vienna was Sigmund Freud. His famous book, Interpretation of Dreams. To remind you, after Germany takes over Austria in March of 1938, he flees and dies shortly thereafter in London. But there is Freud, there is his famous couch. And this is the point where I tell all people listening that you can ask me whatever questions you want, but I want to clarify. I'm the Jewish educator in the family, and my brother is the psychiatrist. So you can ask him those questions related to Freud. However, there is no question that Freud had tremendous impact on our lives. Every time I talk with my brother, I'm thinking, what's going through his mind? But as BBC describes, this amazing, one of the most influential and controversial minds of the 20th century. And as the BBC continues, I would suggest a day or two does not go by without any and all of us invoking some of these terms that are Freudian, right? Look at all this lexicon. He's anal. Oh, he's driven by his libido. She's in denial. They're undergoing, they're repressing their emotions. Oh, wow, what a great, I feel that experience was so cathartic. Oh, that was a Freudian slip. Now, Freudian slip, we all know, is clearly Freudian. Neurotic. All of these terms, by and large, were terms coined by Freud not that long ago, and are such an important part of our common 21st century conversations. The notion of id, ego, superego, all of these three essential parts of our personality are all about Freud. And I end with a quote from psychology.com. He considered dreams to be the royal road to unconsciousness, to our unconscious, right? They serve as valuable clues to how the unconscious mind operates. And one goes to Vienna, and of course you want to see this amazing museum. And there is a museum in Vienna. There it is. There's also a museum in London, by the way, where he schlepped most of his, in Hampstead, where he schlepped most of his supplies and his furnishings because he fled German-speaking Austria in the spring of 1938. And this tension is always there. Yeah, great, Freud, he was Austrian, German-speaking, fantastic, he was. But hey, he had to flee because of what happened in March of 1938. So that kind of double tension of the pride in Mahler, and the pride in Freud, and the pride in the secessionist school of art, and the pride in the architecture of the Ringstrasse, and the pride, it's all this pride on the one hand. On the other hand, and you'll see in a couple minutes as I move toward the ending of my presentation, and that is, it's a lot more complicated than just being proud of these great Austrians. Now, Herzl and Freud never met. Believe it or not, these two of the most, and I don't know if I would say Herzl was Viennese. I mean, he was probably more Budapest than Viennese, but remember, he was born in 1816, died in 1904. So half of his life almost was in Budapest, the other half in Vienna and traveling elsewhere. They lived in the same street for 2 years, but they never met. And one of my big fantasies, Freud would say maybe dreams, right? utopian ideas would be, what would happen if by chance they met in one of those famous Vietnamese coffee shops? Can you imagine? Oh, Dr. Herzl, tell me about your dream. Well, his dream was to have a Jewish state. Phenomenal. They never met, but they did correspond. And in 1898, Freud has what is called a Zionist dream. Right? Freud goes to one of Herzl's plays. Don't read this paragraph. Don't worry about it. He goes to one of Herzl's plays, and he has a dream afterwards. And in his dream, essentially, which is then written down in his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, he has this bizarre dream of assimilated Jews in turn of the century of Vienna. Both him and Herzl fit this, by the way, confronted by those of anti-Semitism like the mayor and his popular following. The post-Enlightenment version of ancient and medieval hatred, Freud's dream, sought a solution. Didn't come up with a solution, but he, at Passover time, which is fantastic, because Passover, is the holiday of the Exodus, but also the rebirth and the renewal. So Freud did a lot of thinking, it's clear, about Herzl and Zionism, but never came out and emphatically supported the Jewish state. But maybe you could say was a closet fan of Herzl, right? Freud writes to Herzl. He sends him a complimentary copy of The Interpretation of Dreams, maybe to review it and get some good press in the paper that Herzl worked for in Vienna. And he asked him, and he said to him in his dedication, as a sign of the esteem in which I, like so many others, this is Freud writing Herzl, have held the poet and fighter for the human rights of our people, right? Now, did they know each other? Letters by Anna Freud. Don't worry about the details. Again, amazing, from my friend David. It's hard for you to read, but I will read it. It says, any rumor on the left-hand side over here, any rumor that Hans Herzl or any other members of his family was ever in analytic touch or in treatment with my father is 100% unfounded. As you say in your letter, there was evidently a confusion between Jung and my father. What is known to me of the Herzl family in the past, they lived quite near us in Vienna, and I often heard talk that the son did his schooling in England, etc. I never met Pauline. So it's clear that they knew of each other. It's kind of weird, if you ask me. They knew of each other, the two of the world's most prominent Jews ever in the past 120 years, but they never met. They corresponded, but they sent complimentary letters, whatever, but they never met. Listen to Stefan Zweig. In his last book he published, it came up posthumously, took his life, as I said, in South America, about Herzl. Herzl's fantastic plan to end the Jewish problem. Originally, the idea of Herzl was mass baptism. We all walk into Stephansdom, the main cathedral in the center of the old city of Vienna, and all of us, great. Wasn't quite going to be the most feasible thing. And then Stefan Zweig continues. I was still in high school when the short pamphlet, The Jewish State, comes out, penetrating as a steel shaft. All I can remember is the astonishment and annoyance of the Jewish circles in Vienna. The rabbis thundered passionately from the pulpits. The head of the New Free Press forbade the very mention of the word Zionism in his, quote, progressive newspaper. True. It didn't come from the well-situated, comfortable bourgeois Jews of the West, but from the gigantic masses of Jews from the East. Without realizing, Herzl, with his pamphlet in 1896, The Jewish State, had brought to flame the glowing coal of Judaism, long smoldering in the ashes, the 1,000-year messianic dream confirmed in the holy books of the return to the promised land. So Herzl really came on intellectual, integrated Jewish Vienna by storm, were massively involved in contributing to this culture in so many ways. Yes, the mayor's anti-Semitic, but we're still involved in all of these fields. Things are okay. Wish Luger wasn't around, but it hits Viennese Jewry in the kishkas, as we like to say, because they don't like this idea of some guy suggesting we should have our own state somewhere else. He dies, as I say, in 1904. There are announcements from David's collection again in July of 1904. He is then buried in Vienna. And again, please, you'll see the tomb of Herzl. There it is. He dies in 1904. One of his last wishes, by the way, as you see his tomb, was, and his wife, Jeanette, was to move to the land of Israel. 1949, one of the first acts of the government of Israel was to exhume from Vienna and rebury in Jerusalem on top of a mountain, which we call in the larger name the Mountain of Memory, the site of the military cemetery and Yad Vashem, or Holocaust Museum, and the tomb of Theodor Herzl, and that section is called Mount Herzl. He is there buried kind of at the top of this pantheon of our past, of our ideological founder of political Zionism, and the pantheon of our political leaders on top of Mount Zion. So 1949, that happens. But listen to Stefan Zweig describing in his last book, right? And when did he write this? Is he recollecting this 39 years after the fact? He was in school, Stefan Zweig at the time, and he writes the following. Suddenly, to all the railroad stations in the city by day and by night, from all realms and lands, every train brought new arrivals, Western, Eastern, Turkish, Russian, from all over the place, right? Never was it more clearly manifest what strife and talk had hitherto concealed. It was a great moment whose leader had now fallen. Keep in mind, he wrote when Herzl had his ideas, wasn't accepted by the intellectual elite in Vienna. The procession was endless. Vienna, startled, became aware that it was not just a writer or a mediocre poet who had passed away, but one of those creators of ideas who disclosed themselves triumphantly in a single country to a single people at vast intervals. A tumult ensued at the cemetery. Too many had suddenly stormed to his coffin, crying, sobbing, screaming in a wild explosion of despair. It was almost a riot of fury. All regulation was upset through a sort of elementary and ecstatic mourning such as I'd never seen before nor since at a funeral. And it was this gigantic outpouring of grief from the depths of millions of souls that made me realize for the first time how much passion and hope this lone and lonesome man had borne into the world through the power of a single thought. Incredible language and prose of Stefan Zweig describing how Hitler was received. Oh, sorry, I keep saying this, I apologize. How Herzl was received in Vienna in 1904 on his death, very different from his radical ideas in the late 19th, 20th century. Viktor Frankl, probably the third of the most famous Viennese Jews. I'm not saying that Gustav Mahler wasn't, but I'm saying Jews until the end of their life, identifying Jewish, practicing Judaism. Frankl was a psychiatrist, born in 1905. So in 1938, when the Germans come in, he's already 33. He's established in his career. He goes to a few concentration camps, Auschwitz, Theresienstadt, and he founds a new theory of psychotherapy called logotherapy, the center of which is, quite simply, that man's primary motivational force is man's search for meaning. And this notion of meaning-centered school of psychotherapy is considered the third Viennese school of psychotherapy. First was Freud, second was Alfred Adler, also Jewish, by the way. Most of us have never come across him. But why Viktor Frankl do I bring into the presentation? Because he lived in Vienna until 1938. The book that he writes after the war, in 1946, so it's before Elie Wiesel writes Night, has sold almost 10 million copies by now. And it's called, originally it was called, I should say, Nevertheless Saying Yes to Life, a Psychologist's Experience in the Concentration Camp. And unlike Elie Wiesel's books, I'm sorry you don't see all my text here, he was basically not trying to explain life in the camp, but trying to understand from a professional point of view, as somebody who was there, who survived, who didn't survive. That's me, and that's my wife, Michelle. We were last there. There's the place where he lived, 1905 to 1942. Well, yeah, then he was ultimately sent out to Theresienstadt and Auschwitz. Very important figure inside of Vienna. He comes back, by the way, and he continues to live in Austria after the end of the war. And a number of very powerful quotes. One of my favorite, most important books behind me on my shelf over there. Every time my kids went with high school to Poland, I said, you got to read one book you choose. It's either Elie Wiesel's Night or Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And some quotes that when I was putting this together in Corona, I continue to find very inspiring, even though there are infinite differences between our challenges today, Corona era, and the life and death challenges he had. Everything can be taken from man, he said, from the German point of view, but one thing. The last of the human freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's way. We're in a different reality today than he was. Again, different planet, to say the least. We choose how we respond to the challenges life throws our way. Any man can decide what shall become of him, mentally and physically. It is this spiritual freedom, which cannot be taken away, that makes life meaningful and purposeful. Very similar, by the way, with Natan Sharansky, the prisoner of Zion, stuck in solitary confinement in Siberia for years. Very similar, his sense of purpose and his sense of meaning. And he quotes Nietzsche. He says, "He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how." Could be the guiding motto of his, what I said earlier, his logotherapy. Life ultimately means taking responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for each individual. And finally, according to logotherapy, the striving to find a meaning in one's life is the primary motivational force of man. He said that those people who gave up, said, "There's no reason for me to live anymore," that was it. And those who said, "I want to continue to live to whatever, write the next opera, to see my children, to go back to my town, to find my bit," those are the people who managed to hold on. And as I said, some, although written about his life in concentration camps, some, I think, phenomenally inspiring and sources of strength for us in even 2022. Man is capable of changing the world for the better if possible, and of changing himself for the better if necessary. And amazing, and it connects to where you guys are in America. In fact, freedom is in danger of degenerating into mere arbitrariness unless it is lived in terms of responsibleness. That's why I recommend the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast for freedom to be supplemented by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. So we're doing another 3 sessions after this week together. I hope by 3 weeks from now, one of you will have erected a Statue of Responsibility somewhere above the Hollywood sign in LA. Good luck getting zoning permits for it. A human being is not one in pursuit of happiness, but rather in search of a reason to become happy. And I asked myself, and that's why I included Viktor Frankl. Not all of you have heard of Viktor Frankl, you've heard of many others, but here is this incredible man who came out with incredible insights, having been to the depths of human behavior in Auschwitz and other camps in Europe. So read Man's Search for Meaning if you haven't. I want to take us back as I approach my last few slides and my last few minutes before I open it up for questions. And that is the 15th century destruction of Jewish life. Remember, Jews who didn't convert were killed, synagogue burnt, etc. And in the square, you can actually still see this sign up on the wall, which is basically in German talking about the Catholic triumph over Judaism. It's still there from 600 years ago. And on the opposite wall, very hard to see and very hard to take a picture of. And I couldn't find a picture on the internet. So this is a picture, both of them are pictures from my phone, but look at this amazing text that is written on the right. And it's a piece that was put up in 1998 by the Catholic Church in Austria, asking for forgiveness in German and English. Where is it here? I'm going to read it from my iPad, sorry. Kiddush Hashem means sanctification of God. With this awareness, Jews of Vienna and the synagogue here on the Judenplatz, the center of a significant Jewish community, chose a voluntary death at the time of the persecution of 1420-21. In order to escape the forced baptism they feared, others, about 200, were burned alive at the stake in Erdberg. Okay, tragic story, but no mention of this in the square until 1998. Christian preachers of that time spread superstitious anti-Jewish ideas and agitated against Jews and their faith. Under this influence, Christians in Vienna accepted the crime without resistance. They approved it and became perpetrators. In this way, the destruction of the Viennese Jewish city in 1421 was already a threatening omen for the events that took place in all of Europe at the time of the National Socialist tyranny. Fantastic! The Catholic Church in Vienna is suggesting there is a linkage between the 1421 murder of the Jews and end of Jewish life in Vienna, temporarily, until 1700, and what happened in the 1930s. Medieval popes turned without success against this anti-Jewish superstition, and individual believers fought in vain against the racial hatred of the National Socialists. They were too few. Today, Christianity regrets its share and responsibility for the persecution of Jews and realizes its failure. For Christians today, Kiddush Hashem, or sanctification of God, can only mean asking for forgiveness and hoping in God's saving action. And I put this as part of my presentation because it's very important to realize that this is the voice of reason, of tolerance, of post-Vatican II, 1965, a fundamental watershed in how the Catholic Church at least deals with its relationship with Judaism, and it's there in the square opposite this incredible sculpture as a memorial put up to the Holocaust by Rachel Whitbread, a British artist, if I'm not Whitehead, sorry, White Reed, sorry, White Red. And it's basically, it's a library. I don't know if you can see here, but there are books. There's a little inscription here, and the books are the, what's the word? Not the side that you see where there's a title in a library, but the opposite. In other words, the ideas that the Jews contributed to in Vienna were closed off and only seen on the inside. And it's a very powerful, stark memorial. In the back over here, around this corner, underneath here, walk down about 3 flights of stairs, and that's where the Jewish Museum is. That is the archaeological ruin of the synagogue destroyed in 1420-21. So you've got a square where on one side is this museum, archaeologically preserved, this new 22-year-old memorial, and on the other wall are these two inscriptions. One of Christian supersessionism, triumphalism over Judaism, medieval era, not taken down. And here, the 1998 Catholic Church saying, hey, we're sorry, and there's a connection between what happened then and what happened in the 20th century. And then finally, I'm going to share with you this memorial, very controversial, that has changed over time in Vienna, right outside the Albertina Museum there, called the Memorial Against War and Fascism. It's made up of at least 1, 2, 3, 4 parts. It wasn't always that way. In fact, when it opens in 1998, and you can see from another angle, so here I took, this is not me, but this is a picture from my phone. I was standing over here, looking through there and seeing this image in the front, and the image there, and the image there, right? The 4 kind of in this continuum. And it's this piece here that I want you to notice, which is a Jewish man scrubbing the streets, and they put barbed wire on. Later, why? When it was unveiled in 1988, it was very controversial because it was universal and there's no specific mention of the humiliation and persecution of the Jews by the Germans and the Viennese in March of 1938 after the Anschluss, when they were forced to wash the streets with their brushes and toothbrushes. The Jewish man was added later. In other words, this wasn't here when it first opened in 1988. It wasn't there. They added the man, clearly Jewish, although he's not wearing a head covering, right? And when people began to sit on this, what they thought piece of art, because there's nothing there, marks it off, nothing it really says. It just says it is it's the Memorial Against War and Fascism. And they put barbed wire on. And then people say it must be Jewish, barbed wire, to prevent people from sitting on it. There was no barbed wire. On top of the Jew forced to scrub the streets by the Germans invaders and by the Germans by the Austrian Germans embracing the Nazi bear hug of Austria in March of 1998. Very, very controversial. And there is nothing really publicly in Vienna that says, oh, and I talked about this last week in Budapest, right? That less than 10-year-old Viktor Orban constructed memorial, how the German eagle comes down and sweeps and devours Hungary. Well, it's not quite that story in Hungary, and it's definitely not the story in Vienna. There were many of Hitler's willing executioners, and many senior Nazis were Austrian, of course, as well, as part of the implementation of the final solution. So here's a city where there's lots of Jewish story, lots of culture. I want to end on a bit of a sweeter note because ultimately we can look at, as we have many Jewish communities, 1,000 years of Jewish life in Europe, but in some ways maybe it's too much information, too many visuals, too much of Mike talking, and we should just say, you know what? They tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. And if you do eat, you must go to the Sacher Hotel and you must have a piece of Sacher torte. Amazing. It's made out of crushed almond flour. So there's no flour. My wife is gluten-free and she loves the Sacher torte. Go in the Sacher restaurant and have a Sacher torte. And if you can't get in there or don't want to pay too much money, go to any other places and get a Sacher torte. And of course, what other great contribution to human civilization than beer and Viennese schnitzel? I recommend the chicken, but that's another story, and some great coffee. And as you have a cup of coffee in Vienna, ask yourself, hey, what would have happened if Herzl and Freud would have met each other, number one? And number two, hey, what would have happened had the Viennese intellectual elite at least, responded differently in the 1930s to what was going on in Europe and embraced that significant part of the population, the 20% of Vienna that was Jewish, right? 200,000 out of a million people, who were really at the forefront of trying to make Vienna one of, if not the, cultural intellectual capitals of the world. And literally in a day, in March of 1938, all of that ends with the Anschluss. And with that, I've taken an hour, I've talked too fast as always, and I turn it over to you, Rabbi, to try to monitor the chat and some of the questions.
So before we go to the chat, I have two questions. One's just very short. Did Herzl have children, and did they follow in his footsteps in any way?
Great question. He had three kids. One died in the Holocaust. One was murdered, I should say, in the Holocaust. One, I think, Trudy, the daughter. One died in America. And the third one took his life by jumping off a bridge in Washington, D.C. after he found out that his brother had died. So there are no biological descendants of Theodor Herzl.
But were they Zionists? Were they Zionists?
No, they're living in America and living in Europe, and killed, ultimately sent out to one, I think it was Auschwitz. I don't remember where his daughter was ultimately murdered. Yeah. Tragic.
Oh, and my other question.
Hold on, Rabbi, sorry, there was a few years ago, they brought back the remains of, I want to say, the grandchildren or something of Herzl. It's a crazy story, but or maybe them, and should they have been brought there if they weren't Zionist? Big question. But they're buried next to Herzl as well. Please.
My other question is, why do you think Vienna, what was it about Austria or the culture, if any, that had such Jewish culture and creativity blossom in that way? What do you think? Do you know of any? Have they ever tried to figure that out? What was it?
First of all, I would say it's a great question. Milan Kundera, the Jews were part of the mortar that put things together. I think that, and there's similarity, I think, in the American contribution, the Jewish contribution to America. Look, America is a fundamentally different society than these nation states in Europe. So here you've got these countries developing over centuries, and as empires rising and falling and rising and falling, and Jews are part and not part and kicked out and brought in, and only in the modern era. And again, when we look at Judaism post 18th century, the center of Jewish life was in Europe. I'm not talking the Middle East, Ashkenazi, but was in Europe. And we were part of and products of all the ideas that were in Europe at the time. And so this notion of the emancipation of humanity from being ruled by monarchs who were made monarchs by divine right was very important. And intellectual ideas. And the moment that we were given the opportunity to be just like everybody else, we said, wow, 1800 years we were not, and now we are, let's go for it. And we did. And if you think of your parents and grandparents as immigrants who did whatever they could, because America allowed them and provided them that opportunity for the first time ever for most of your family trees to be just like everybody else, you did. And that's what Herzl writes. As hard as we have endeavored to be contributors to the host societies in which we live, and we out-French the French and we out-American the Americans and whatever else, we were not allowed the opportunity to do so. We were seen as outsiders. And I want to go off on the edge here too much, Rabbi, but when you look at this whole conflict over Holocaust and race and Whoopi Goldberg, right, we are considered whites in America, although some of you might even be Persian in this community, clearly, right? We are considered whites because if race
we have African American Jews in our community,
right? If race is a subjective, is a subjective social construct rather than biological, which is what Hitler was trying to argue, then in America we are seen as white as we were kind of in Europe until we are not. In other words, till they think that we should be seen as outsiders, and then we're different.
Yes. I had one more question. It just went out of my mind. Okay, wait. About I don't know. I'm sorry. I looked at some of the chat and I got distracted about it.
I'll tell you one more story, Rabbi.
One more thing.
Another question.
I remember. Are you aware of Friedel Dicker Brandeis?
Brandeis, I know.
Friedel Dicker Brandeis was an artist. She was from Vienna. She was the only woman in the Bauhaus.
Okay.
You should include her in your talk. And then she fled to Prague, and then she was sent to Theresienstadt. And she was a great artist, and she took her art supplies into Theresienstadt, and all those children paintings and art is from her. She was their teacher, and she invented art therapy in that camp in order to take the children out of their horrible conditions through art and imagination.
Well, Rabbi, please send me, just to show me write down her name. I'll Google her. And two reasons. One is Theresienstadt is fascinating, the story of the children and making art there.
She was the teacher.
And three is my daughter is studying to be an art therapist. So those are three reasons why I'm fascinated by that story. I will share one story, and then I actually have to go because I have another presentation. Don't ask. And that is this. First time I went to Vienna, I was going 10, 12, 15, I guess, years ago. I was going to go to Poland. I was going to Poland to meet a group that I was going to guide there. And the agent booking my ticket said, well, I'm flying you through Vienna because you have to go to Krakow, and there's no flight from Tel Aviv to Krakow. And the question is, do you want 2 hours in Vienna or 12 hours? I said, I've never been to Vienna. I'll go for the 12-hour Vienna. Why not? So I spoke to a friend of mine, a guide in Poland. I said, what should I do? Where should I go? So he gave me some suggestions, did some research, and I walked around. And I was blown away. I said a couple things. One was, this place is so proper and so punctual and so clean and everything followed by the rules. Wow. And then I walked around and I said, wow, this is incredible, right? There's a library, I forget the name. There's an amazing library from the Habsburg Empire that is there, is beautifully preserved in art and culture. And then kind of you scratch the surface, or maybe I should have taken out my brush and kind of got down on my hands and knees and brushed the surface as we did in March of 1938 in Vienna and say, oh, wait a minute, the story is a little bit more complicated. And Vienna, even more, I think, than Berlin, because what happened in Berlin, when Hitler comes to power, it takes 5 years to get to 5.5 years, from 33 to 38, to get to the United Broken Glass Kristallnacht, November 1938. By the time the Nazis in Germany takes over Austria in March of 1938, people have seen what's happened in Germany, right? It's kind of understandable that the direction is getting progressively worse. You could argue that a Jew in Berlin thought it would get better, and just was kind of stuck in this rapidly kind of descending horrible situation that they were. But in Vienna, like the moment the laws were passed from Germany to Vienna, and it says to me, wow, what is going on in a place that saw itself as one of the greatest centers of creativity, of human thought? Freud, Adler, Viktor Frankl, amazing. And Jews were such an integral part of that. And literally like that, gone. And I don't have an answer. Somebody says, how do you get rid of anti-Semitism? Unfortunately, hatred is as old as the first sibling rivalry that we know of in the Bible. People are different. People are jealous. I don't have a clear answer to it. All I can say is that this, more than maybe any other city that I've presented in Europe, is really perplexing because of those heights of human achievement and creativity matched with the horrible depths of evil perpetrated, and that transition almost instantaneously. You could put it down to the clock in March of 1938. With that, I'm going to say,
thank you so much. It was wonderful as usual and fascinating and a lot to think about.
Thank you all. We'll see you next week in Prague.
I think
if you want any preparation for that, then just read some Franz Kafka. There are lots of questions once you read Kafka.
Thank you so much. Bye,
see
everyone.
You next week. Bye, guys.